Hello and welcome to What is Climate Equity, a first of 5 live explainers celebrating Yale Earth Week 2021. Based on our Yale Experts Explained written series, the purpose of these explainers is really to break down complex hot topics in sustainability using Yale's world-class experience and expertise. Our hope is to really invite everyone into the conversations around climate change and how it affects them. Today, we will have Yale College students Lydia Monk and Nicholas Perez interviewing Yale alum Tambi Matambo. We'll get started in just a moment. At the end of this conversation, if we have some time, we will open it up to Q&A. So as you're listening and getting inspired, I encourage everyone to pop your questions into the Q&A chat. If you have any tech questions, you can put that into the regular chat and my colleagues will certainly address it and help get you settled. Without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to our incredible student interviewers and Yale expert for What is Climate Equity?
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for the introduction, Ashley. And again, thank you all for joining us this evening to kick off an exciting Earth Week with the Yale Office of Sustainability. We'd just like to begin with a statement of inclusion. The Yale Office of Sustainability recognizes that generations of Indigenous peoples and nations have stewarded the lands and waterways of what is now the state of Connecticut. We honor and respect the enduring relationship that exists between these peoples and nations and the land on which Yale's campus resides. We recognize that Indigenous values actively connect to our work, and we seek to learn more about these connections. We understand that the process will be ongoing, and we look forward to opportunities for collaboration. We ask that all participants consider their role in putting us on the pathway to right the wrongs of forced occupancy of land and the subjugation of others. Please find our full land acknowledgement in the chat and learn more about the numerous Indigenous communities that have stewarded Connecticut's land. In the spirit of inclusion, we would also like to remind the audience that live explainers are a neutral and safe space for asking questions and testing ideas. Be open, listen honestly, and act mindfully. Now, without further ado, tonight I will be joined with a fellow first year in sustainability liaison, Nick Perez, in welcoming our guest, Tambi Matambo.
Thank you, Lydia, and thank you everyone for coming. Tambi Matambo currently works in the climate change unit of the World Bank Group as a senior specialist working to integrate climate change into the World Bank Group's engagement with countries across the globe. She is also part of a team that works on coordinating the reporting of the World Bank's COVID-19 response during the pandemic. Tambi has worked in various capacities with the World Bank Group for the past 15 years. She has also worked as the International Policy Coordinator for the U.S. Climate Action Network in Washington, D.C., and the Wildlife Conservation Society in her hometown, Zambia. She holds a bachelor's degree in biological sciences from the University of Zambia and a master's degree in environmental management from the Yale School of the Environment. Her most recent academic focus was on climate change science and policy as it relates to the influence of global institutions on domestic environmental policy. Tambi has also written on international climate policy and climate change adaptation, has extensive experience working on environmental issues in Africa, has lived in Southeast Asia, and currently resides in the United States. So Tambi, just to start off, we like to begin by asking, I guess, a straightforward question about how you define climate equity and climate justice and what it means to you, or what it has come to mean to you and your work in the past years.
Okay, well, thank you very much for having me. I think this is a really great topic. There's a lot of discussion about this topic, and you can sort of come at it from multiple angles. So what it has come to mean to me, based on my professional life, my personal life, I sort of try to look at it from a higher level and then going right down to local levels and personal levels. So as you all know, climate change is a global problem, and it's widely accepted that it will impact the most vulnerable. So to me, the most vulnerable is the most vulnerable countries, the most vulnerable geographical areas within countries. But the most important thing for me through my work and personally is that it's felt mostly at the local level. And therefore, the most vulnerable people will be the ones who will be impacted the most. So in a nutshell, for me, environmental or climate equity really means providing the protection that all people deserve from the adverse impacts and hazards from climate change, as well as ensuring that all people actually benefit from addressing climate change, such as making sure that we're providing access to renewable energy, for instance, climate smart housing to all people, regardless of their social economic status, their gender, or even their race.
Thank you so much for that insightful definition to just kick off our event. One aspect that I found very interesting that you had mentioned was ensuring that all people benefit from addressing climate change. And I know that one aspect of the area of climate equity is climate reparations. And there are many different definitions of climate reparations. So I would just like to ask, based on your work throughout the years, what have climate reparations also come to mean to you?
Okay, so I think for me, climate reparations, I came to realize and to try to understand this term when I was an activist, actually working at the UN climate negotiations, working for US Climate Action Network, actually. And then also, you know, in the various international and national institutions that I've worked for. And for me, I've come to understand reparations as using resources, both international and national, to address the inequalities caused or exacerbated by the climate crisis. Yeah, so that's at least my what I've come to understand climate reparations as over the past few years working.
Thank you. So just like, I guess to talk about that a little bit more and like the role of international governance groups, certainly like historically, there has been countries that have benefited much more from, for example, like the burning of fossil fuels, particularly the global north has traditionally, exploited and has progressed a lot in terms of like, progress, industry. So I guess with considering now like all the countries in the world, particularly through international governance groups, what would you say the role of bodies like the UN are, or like consultancies? What are the shortcomings with regard to climate action?
I think there's a lot of bureaucracy. There's a lot of ideas. I mean, everyone wants to do something, right? So there's a lot of ideas on paper that are hard to implement. And then there's a lot of pressing issues as well, such as right now, we have the pandemic. And I also think at that level, in terms of international consultancies, international governance groups, there's many different interests at the global level. So this is not just amongst countries, but amongst industry, amongst politicians, and there's a whole bunch of geopolitical issues that actually hinder the urgency to act. Everybody knows there's an urgency, but there's quite a lot of shortcomings in the sense that these organizations also have to overcome those particular bureaucratic, geopolitical, multiple interests that are out there that hinder the urgency to act. But at the same time, even though there are shortcomings, there's also a lot they can do, right? For instance, these organizations are powerful enough and are funded. Well, I don't want to say they're funded enough, they should be funded more, to help provide the mechanisms and the financing as well to ensure that there's equitable participation and enough influence by vulnerable groups in the actual decision making that occurs at these levels in order to create the conditions for more inclusive solutions, including designing the right climate policies that will actually give agency to those groups who are most impacted, both socially and economically. So there's shortcomings, but there's also a lot they do and a lot more that they could be doing. Yep.
So you mentioned the various interests, and something I guess I'm a little bit curious about is how international governance conflicts with like industry. In particular, like I know there are a lot of carbon majors, like various, like it's not often the case that when we think about who is responsible for all the carbon emissions today, it's not necessarily like everyone, but more so specific companies, Exxon, and just so I guess curious about how, in your experience, you think international governance can tackle industry with regards to trying to achieve a better, uh, I guess, climate change action than what's traditionally being done with more like broader frameworks like the Paris Climate Accords.
Yeah. So for me, at least in my work, is helping. So this is more on the technical side, right? And the policy side is helping countries create the right policies and incentives to encourage these companies to be more climate smart in their investments. And, you know, there's a huge market out there particularly in developing countries where most of the vulnerable people reside. And so if you help create certain policies, being a powerful international governance group to allow those countries to get to benefit actually from what these companies can actually do and can do in countries where they have the right policies to incentivize them to do good things in certain countries. And I think right now, I think there's a dearth of those kinds of policies that will actually help the most vulnerable countries. And so I think international governance groups and the UN really have a huge role to play in fostering that kind of policy environment in these countries.
Wonderful, thank you for that. I guess kind of on the flip side of Nick's questions, I'd like to ask what do you believe the role of activist grassroots organizations to be in fighting for climate equity?
Well, I mean, I have been an activist and I've worked in grassroots organizations before, and I think it's really accountability, right? Holding countries, politicians, industries, and people on their pledges to address climate change. So you also need this force, right, to hold these institutions and industries accountable on their pledges to address climate change, and to ensure that the most vulnerable are also benefiting from addressing climate change, right? I was reading a story somewhere in Florida where Florida is going to suffer from sea level rise, and a lot of the wealthy people, the wealthier people, actually live by the beach, right? They have all their beautiful houses there. And because it's getting more hazardous to actually live by the beach, they're moving their houses further up. But then the less wealthier people lived further up because they couldn't afford to live down by the beach. And so what does that mean, right? So are you displacing these people who were there before because you're able to? So how do those people also benefit from, building climate smart housing, building houses that are less vulnerable to sea level rise? So for me, I think you truly, truly need all these grassroots organizations, and they don't necessarily have to be climate organizations, right? There's human rights organizations, there's gender-based organizations, there's organizations that protect children. And so I really think that this issue is not just about people who work on climate. And to be honest, I think it shouldn't be just people who work on climate, because I think sometimes we tend to live in this box, but, getting all the ideas, getting all the grassroots movements from various and diverse grassroots organizations and activist groups, I think will definitely help. And of course, I think that the small research institutions that help with understanding the dynamics of inequity when addressing climate change, I mean, these are like invaluable. If without this, there's a risk that the people with the greatest need to actually adapt to climate change will be left out if there's not enough understanding, right? I mean, I can give an example of the pandemic, for instance, coronavirus, where, you know, you needed the science and you needed to understand who was the most vulnerable. And so it's the same thing goes with climate change. And there's been people who've been left out, right, from benefiting from, you know, vaccines from the pandemic, for instance. And so I really think that it's really the whole world that needs to work on this, and ideas from everywhere.
Thank you for that. You mentioned at one point, and it was a point that really stuck out to me, that non-environmental groups should and can get involved in climate work. And I was just wondering what groups specifically you're thinking of when you describe that, and in what ways they can add to the climate movement.
There's a huge intersect between, for example, health and climate. There's a huge intersect between infrastructure and climate. You know, those who are advocating for a road, for instance, in a developing country because they've got no access to go to hospitals, right, or to schools, that what kind of road are we going to build? Are we just going to build a road because we just want to get people to school or to get to hospitals, or do we want more longer term solutions? So there's all those kinds of intersections that I think everyone can get involved in this. Yeah.
Thank you so much. As a former activist, now as a part of larger institutions such as the UN and the World Bank currently, what does it mean to you to be an activist from a larger institution, and how has that changed your view on activism or the work you're doing?
So, I mean, for me, I don't think that you're an activist necessarily only because you are not working in large institutions or not working in powerful institutions. I think there's a lot to be said about activism from within. And even though it might be a little bit more difficult in larger institutions because of all the different aspects and characteristics of large, powerful institutions, things tend to move a little slower. But, you know, for me, it has meant knowing, because I was an activist before, knowing that there will be people to hold institutions accountable. That will help me as an activist within that institution to sort of help move things forward. It also means staying true to your goal, even when things don't move too quickly. And it also means taking note of even the small victories that you win and realizing that they're actually also contributing towards a bigger goal, and just never giving up. Yeah.
Thank you. Just on the topic, I guess, of like representation, several works and studies have recently criticized a lot of like the modern environmental movement for a lack of representational justice, especially like when the movements were starting off in like, the 1970s. A lot of like the big organizations we know today, like the Sierra Club, predominantly white, and even today, I think, I was reading a study a couple weeks ago by Professor Taylor in the School of the Environment, who kind of like looked at the demographics of a lot of like environmental movements today. And while there might be like more equity and inclusion at like the lower level, when you look at like the leadership and like who's like leading all these things, like all these conservation movements, it's also predominantly white activists. So I guess in your experience of like international governance groups, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about like the diversity you've encountered in like your workspaces and what that might mean for climate policy and like representational justice.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. You're definitely right. And I think there has to be a bigger effort from the bigger organizations in making sure, if you really want, and you're saying that you're really representing the interests of the most vulnerable, then if you don't have the most vulnerable front and center of your organization, then how are you truly going to know, right? How to help those people? Because you're coming at it from a different angle. And, representation, diversity, a lot of those people also are coming from it from a different angle. And I think they could benefit from that. And also, I think if you have representation at the highest levels from the people who are at least perceived to be from vulnerable groups, I think it will also help the vulnerable groups themselves realize what's truly at stake in terms of climate change and the environment, right? And will also, I think, the problem is, yes, you're helping vulnerable people, but you think they have nothing to contribute, but they really do. I mean, there's so much local knowledge and there's so much local observation of what's truly happening in your farm. Like my mom, she's a farmer in Zambia, and every single year she's like, oh my goodness, the drought's worse this year. Or if it's not the droughts, that they're able to see these things and experience them. And so, making sure that you have people who actually are experiencing these things in a different way that you are in your organization at a higher level, I think will truly make that change that they're desiring. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think with climate reparations being this new idea, and I guess also just kind of considering like traditional local knowledge, would you say that climate reparations is like an effective policy with regards to I guess compensating or like trying to like restore, like as you were saying, like the drought or like past conditions?
Exactly.
Do you think it's like feasible, and do you have any examples of or do you approve of how it's being approached?
Do I approve? There's various ways of approaching it, and the one that I'm most familiar with at the global level, it's a very tough thing to do, but I know that progress is being made, albeit slowly. For instance, at the UN framework for climate change, the Convention for Climate Change, there's actually, things have moved so much that there's actually now an international mechanism to actually, for loss and damage, right, which is designed to address, certain loss and damages that are associated with the impacts of climate change, including, I think, extreme events and slow onset events in developing countries themselves and the people there that are particularly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. So there's that international mechanism that is moving slowly, but there's progress. Like I said, there's quite a few, I think, organizations, universities that are doing research into understanding how, local solutions work. And I think there's a lot of value in that. And then I think at an even bigger level, in terms of reparations and the way a lot of grassroots organizations define reparations is, the high emitters, right? And I think just a couple of days ago, there was a great signal, I think, lately at the global level. And this is the US and China together, actually, the two highest emitters of carbon have actually agreed to cooperate to curb climate change with pretty much with urgency. I mean, they use the word urgency. And for me to see the US and China actually coming together with these statements, to me, is progress. How they're going to do it is another thing, but the fact that it's happening, I think, is extremely important and the right direction, so that they can help create the conditions that are necessary for things like technology transfers and finance and so on, for to help those who haven't, so to speak, been responsible for what's going on right now in terms of climate change.
Thank you so much for your thoughtful answers to our questions. And now that Nick and I have asked our most pressing questions, we are ready to open up to the audience for the Q&A section of our explainer tonight. So everyone in the audience can use the Q&A feature to send in any questions, and we'll just give a few moments for those to come in. Okay, it looks like we have our first question, and it is, what role do local communities or universities like Yale play in advancing climate equity? And follow-up questions such as are like, where can they begin, and what is the number one thing you wish you would see high school students do to address climate change? And I think that could also include college students
Yeah.
at Yale listening in the audience.
Yeah. Yale, I think, when I talked about grassroots organizations that should be doing research on local knowledge and doing research on helping the understanding and the dynamics of inequities as it relates to climate change, I think Yale has a huge role to play there. And so, resources, I think, providing the resources for students to actually go out in these areas, and students who are interested in working in these areas, and making sure that they're providing the resources for them to actually go there and help, and providing resources for research, for faculty, right? I still think, to be honest, that there's still, I think we could do a lot more at Yale in terms of that. Yeah, it's happening, but I think there's still a lot more to be done.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, and then high school, college students, high school, yes, high school doesn't have that many resources. But I think even here in the US, everybody tends to think, oh, the most vulnerable groups, okay, they're far, far away in Africa or in Asia or whatever. But they're right here too, right? Go to your local communities. The same gaps in access to education, income generating opportunities, in historically disadvantaged communities. I think, if there's lots of push these days for high school students to do something, and colleges are placing a lot of emphasis, I think, on helping your community. I think there's definitely a lot more room for high school students to get more involved in this historically disadvantaged communities around them.
Thank you. That's super interesting. I know at the end you paused and said you believe that Yale should and can do more, and I was just wondering if you could expand on that a little more concretely on what policies or actions you think that Yale should take.
When I was at the School of Environment, there was the Tropical Resources Institute. And the Tropical Resources Institute actually funded my research going back to Zambia, doing my research there. So there's one place, look at me advocating for the Tropical Resources Institute. So there's one place that I think, work at it there. Two, I think that they should encourage more research, the faculty research, in more historically disadvantaged communities. I know Yale likes to solve big problems, which is great, but there's also the little problems that have to be solved in order to solve the big problems. So, and then I think the last thing is trying to be more proactive in, like we just talked about it, the big organizations and there's no representation, trying to make an effort actually at the environment school that they are getting the right voices and the right representation there too, in terms of not only their faculty, but also the student body. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Just, I guess, shifting gears a little bit, back to international policy and just policy in general. One of the questions says, where does the money come from to fight climate change and to finance a just transition? what is the view of developing countries to establish carbon pricing nationally?
Mm. Well, carbon pricing is well, first of all, it's difficult at the international level, like even for the most developed countries, as they're called. And I think even more difficult for the countries that are the most vulnerable in setting up, the polluter pays kind of carbon pricing policies. So I think that there's a lack of knowledge out there in developing countries as to how carbon pricing can actually benefit them. So there are some countries actually that I've worked in. For instance, Ethiopia is seriously thinking about, how do they change their taxing policies, for instance, in order to benefit their populations, right? How do you change your tax structure to create policies that can help create a carbon pricing system that's particular to Ethiopia's own national instances and circumstances. So I think it's really a lack of knowledge and maybe lack of interest in big organizations in really trying to do more research on how can this work, right? In these countries that have many other issues they have to address, and how can a carbon price actually be redirected to address poverty and the vulnerabilities that come with vulnerabilities of the country's climate and the country's people to the impacts of climate change.
Yeah. Related to policies as well, we have a question that is Yale Nobel laureate James Tobin proposed a Tobin tax from 0.01 to 0.5% on the national energy budgets of the top 5 countries and revenues of the top 5 energy companies. Mm-hmm. These would be voluntary, but peer pressure would apply. Any other countries and companies can also look good by participating. The funds would be managed by either A, the donor institutions, B, experts in the field, and C, recipient economies. And these dollar amounts look huge, to quote the asker. What do you think about this policy?
I think anybody powerful out there who's pushing for a carbon pricing policy is a great thing, right? I just think that carbon pricing will only work if it's not seen as something that can only be done in certain types of countries. And so there's got to be a way in which that initiative can also help to look at how it can be done in other countries that are not like the top 5 or the top 5 industry or the top 5 country. It's a tough thing. I mean, we try to, I know I used to work in Ethiopia and try to talk to them about carbon pricing. They're really interested, but there's a lot of complexities that they need people with carbon pricing knowledge to sort of help them break through these quagmires of how they do it there in the context of reducing poverty, right? You reduce poverty and you reduce vulnerabilities to climate change. So that would be my answer to that.
Shifting towards maybe the communities in poverty and the people most affected by the climate crisis, we have a question about health. Given the health-related morbidity and mortality related to air pollution and extreme heat around the world, do you think that there should be a larger effort in educating healthcare professionals to better communicate these risks to their patients, especially the most vulnerable ones?
Yes, absolutely. And that's why I should have said, I think I did say health professionals. Oh, absolutely. Even here in the US, I was reading somewhere about how Baltimore, for instance, the vulnerable communities in Baltimore and people with health conditions in Baltimore suffer most in the summer because, they don't have air conditioners that work. And so, the heat and the effects of the heat on vulnerable communities who also have health issues that are impacted by, those kinds of things that, not so much. I mean, what is this vulnerable community person going to do in Baltimore? They don't have air conditioning, right? But I think maybe that what the health professionals should be doing is being more activists, actually, for their own patients, either to governments or grassroots organizations that can actually address the issues that make it more difficult for those communities to adapt to increasing temperatures, and they don't have air conditioners. So I think the health professionals need to become more activists, I think, on climate change, because it is, I mean, there's a huge link between health and climate. So yeah.
With regards to, I guess, the progression of climate change, I don't remember if this was in conversation or in a reading, but I kind of encountered this idea that a reason why, or at least one of the reasons why recently in the United States, there's been a huge resurgence of environmental movements is because the effects of climate change are becoming very visible to us. And I guess approaching the tipping point, I was wondering, how close do you think we are to this tipping point where climate change is irreversible? But more specifically, what does that look like for vulnerable communities, especially considering the fact that now we're more alert to our winters feel hotter.
Yeah.
The effects of flooding and extended drought has definitely been impacting many other countries and communities in general.
Yeah, that's a tough question. And there's lots of scientific literature out there about the tipping point. I think tipping points will be felt in places that are the most vulnerable, right? Because if you see that, you've got enough resources to say, okay, I'm seeing this, my house is flooding more, there's more seawater or whatever, but I can afford to move, right? Entirely pick up and go. There's people who are getting displaced, right? There's all this new talk of climate refugees and all those kinds of things. So for me, I think the tipping points really will be felt in the most vulnerable areas and areas that, socioeconomic vulnerabilities, income generating activities that are vulnerable to climate change. I think the tipping points will actually, in fact, they're probably already being felt, to be honest. And I hear my mom talking in Zambia, she used to grow this and grow that, and she's not able to do that. So they're seeing it. Yeah, we're reaching it, honestly. Yeah.
That's really interesting to hear. Going forward in climate work, understanding how urgent of an issue this is. To leave us off on one last note, maybe a little more positive, I was wondering what or who makes you hopeful about climate equity, and if you could travel back in time and tell your younger self, one thing that you have learned through your experience, what would it be?
You know what? I think that communities or vulnerable communities, whatever, I think they are speaking up, right? Because they're beginning to feel it. And I think for me, that's a positive. The other positive is movements that are supposedly unrelated to climate change, movements that are fighting for equity in other areas like race. I think when you're addressing those kinds of things, you're also helping address the inequities related to climate change and some of the institutional barriers that are there that are keeping people in poverty and not able to move their homes or be displaced, by a flood and all those kinds of things. So I think that's a positive. And then what would I tell my younger self? Well, what I realized, my younger self, is that I always thought, oh, it's this global thing and it's these, bigger countries that are responsible. But I also sort of humbled myself and realized that even at the national level, right, those inequities exist, even in the so-called vulnerable countries, that those inequities exist, and that the middle class in those countries is actually growing, like my country, Zambia, so much so that there's activists there for, anti-deforestation and water pollution. And recently I saw something in one of our newspapers in Zambia where the president was like, it's two things that are going to destroy Zambia, right? One of them is the pandemic and the other one's climate change. And that's something that I haven't heard. And to make that link, from a country from a leader of a country like mine, I think is positive. So, there are some positive things happening there. It's just that urgency, right? That all countries really need to just realize and just do something. So yeah, it's happening.
Well, we are right at time. So on behalf of Yale Sustainability, I extend my greatest thanks to Tambi for sharing your expertise today, and to Lydia and Nick for being such solid interviewers and for inviting the community into this conversation. If you loved this conversation, we have 4 more on each remaining day of Earth Week. Feel free to register for future live explainers on our website and explore our calendar of events and library of opportunities for learning and action at earthweek.yale.edu. Thanks and have a great night.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.